Hello everybody, welcome back to Allan Walls Photography. This is Allan, and today is part 3 of the Lighting for Photography series, and we're going to take a look at the absolutely fascinating world of incandescent light. Like this. Thank you very much to my Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate your help. And to those of you who've made a donation through the website, you too are hugely appreciated. Thank you so much. If you desire to join that illustrious band of generous people, there is a link right here that you can follow that will take you to a place that will make it happen for you. All right, let's get into it. I've really been looking forward to doing this video because this subject is really quite interesting. What we're going to talk about today is incandescence and what that means. Then I'm going to tell you everything I know about tungsten, and I'll describe the anatomy of light bulbs and how all that works. Then we'll look at a bunch of use cases for tungsten-based incandescent light in photography. And then at the end we'll cover the various ways that you can modify tungsten light, and we'll talk very briefly about how tungsten incandescent light is used in macro photography, because it isn't. That'll be a quick part. So what is incandescence anyway? The first thing you probably think about when you think about incandescent light is a light bulb. A light bulb is a high electrically resistant filament of something inside a glass globe filled with nothing or something, and an electrical current is passed through that filament. And because it's highly resistant to the passage of electricity, it heats up and it starts to glow. That glowing is the incandescent light. And while the light is really nice to look at, it renders colors beautifully. It's relatively inexpensive. You can operate it on AC or DC current. It doesn't require any type of electrical ballast or other external controlling system. But it's really, really hot, and it's really, really inefficient. In fact, incandescent light has an efficiency of about 5%. The way we measure efficiency of lighting is actually through a concept called luminous efficacy, which is the number of lumens of light you get for a watt of energy in a particular system. Now, because the human retina is most sensitive to monochromatic green light, it is monochromatic green light that would be theoretically the most efficient kind of incandescent light. And according to the mathematics, the most efficient incandescent light source you could imaginably have is 683 lumens per watt. But in the real world, nothing gets even close to that. So if we take a look at the regular light bulbs we operate on 110 or 120 volts around our houses, they are only putting out about 16 lumens per watt of power. So if you compare that 16 lumens per watt to the theoretical maximum of 683 lumens per watt, you can start to get a feel for just how incredibly inefficient incandescent light is. Probably 5% is as good as you're going to get, which means that a 100-watt light bulb like this is actually only putting out about 1100 lumens, and a 40-watt light bulb puts out about 450 lumens, which is not a lot of light considering the wattage that is passing through it. So it's inefficient. Throughout this video, I'm going to use the word tungsten in two different ways. One will be to describe the 74th element in the periodic table, a transition metal in group 6b, along with chromium and molybdenum and seabornium. I'll also use the word to describe a particular kind of light, a light that operates around 3200 Kelvin. And that is the prototypical incandescent light bulb temperature. So let me talk for a couple of minutes about what a light bulb is in today's world. It's changed a lot since Edison didn't invent it. A light bulb is basically a thin filament of wire, most often made out of tungsten, and I'll talk about that in a second, that's suspended between two electrodes inside a little bottle of glass that is filled with a gas. It's not under very high pressure. In fact, it's under lower pressure than our atmosphere, about 3/4 of an atmosphere to be precise. And the gas inside can be argon or nitrogen. Any of the inert gases will do. The way it works is the positive and the negative electrodes receive power, AC or DC, like I said, and that energy will travel through the filament. But the filament, tungsten, is incredibly resistant to the flow of electricity. So instead of allowing the current to pass, it blocks the current and in the process begins to heat up. And it heats up very fast until, in fact, the thing glows. And depending on the amount of current and the type of filament, it can get very, very bright indeed. But because of its inefficiency, it also gets very, very hot indeed. Now, over the years, the simplest idea of a light bulb has changed dramatically. So don't think that all light bulbs are equal, because they're not. This, for example, which is a typical light bulb with an argon-filled glass tube and a tungsten filament that gives off a daylight-corrected, fairly white light, 5000 K light. These, by the way, the white bulbs that give off natural light or daylight, the inside of the globe is actually coated with powdered kaolin, clay. The reason being that this acts as a filter that changes the color of the light so that it looks more like daylight. And therefore, as a photographer, I probably wouldn't call this incandescent or tungsten light like I would this, or even this, just the clear light bulb. This will give off a tungsten light. But even the ones that look clear in the modern day may not be. The glass that's used in making the envelopes for incandescent light are often doped with other chemicals. By doping, I mean that these elements are added to molten glass as the bulbs are being blown, and it changes the characteristic of the light as it passes through the glass. Cobalt is used to give the light a bluish cast. Chromium gives a greenish cast, and molybdenum is used as a dopant to create a broader spectrum white light. So even though this looks like a pure tungsten bulb, it may not be, and your eyes will have to be the judge of that. Conversely, a lot of non-incandescent light sources like LEDs, CFIs, or compact fluorescent lights can be modified to give off tungsten light. It's probably worth mentioning briefly that the whole world of lighting is undergoing a metamorphosis because of the incredible inefficiency of these bulbs. They're being phased out. Incandescent light, in the home setting at least, is probably going to go away, and probably quite soon. They're cheap to buy. They're not that cheap to operate, but they burn a lot of energy. and that energy has to come from somewhere. So what is it that makes tungsten such a good choice for incandescent light bulbs? Edison was still using carbon-coated fibers as his filaments in his light bulbs back in 1904. A couple of Eastern European guys with really cool names, Sandor Just and Franjo Hahnemann, came up with the idea of using tungsten because of its chemical properties. It's extremely resistant to the passage of electricity. It's not particularly chemically reactive, so it doesn't tend to rust or form oxides spontaneously. Probably one of the most amazing breakthroughs in light bulb technology was figuring out how to take a dense, brittle, hard metal like tungsten and turn it into a long, fine, bendable wire that would retain its shape. It involves dozens of steps, heating and cooling in different ways, cooling under pressure, cooling under negative pressure, all kinds of steps. But the end result is this very thin, very fine, very springy filament. I smashed the light bulb so that I could show you what the filament looks like. And you can see the remarkable properties of springiness that the resulting filament has. You'll hear some high-intensity incandescent lights referred to as quartz lights or possibly halogen lamps. These terms refer to modifications that were made to the original design of a tungsten light bulb. And in the first case of quartz, it refers to an envelope that's made of melted quartz crystals, basically formed into a globe, and that's where the filament is, inside of that globe. The reason being that quartz can stand much higher temperatures than glass before it melts or cracks. So in very high intensity devices using incandescent light, you'll frequently see quartz in the name. Similarly, halogen refers to adding the vapor of iodine or bromine inside that fused quartz envelope. And what that does is it helps reflect the energy back onto the filament so that, first of all, less of the tungsten evaporates, but more so it makes the lamp much more efficient in that it allows the temperature to be retained by the filament, meaning that it can operate at a higher temperature using less current. I hope that makes sense, but don't be too confused by the terms. A quartz halogen lamp is still an incandescent lamp. The quartz halogen lamps will often still be enclosed in a larger glass envelope, and the reason for that is to keep you away from the quartz part on the inside, which gets really, really hot. This allows an insulation layer, if you will. Other forms of incandescent light include this bulb, for example, has a powder coating on the front, on the inside, to create a more daylight balanced light. But it also has a mirrored portion behind. And the reason for this is also to reflect heat energy back onto the filament to make it more efficient. By the way, for the longest time, light bulbs have been labeled according to the amount of power they consume. So we talk about 40-watt bulbs, 60-watt bulbs, 75-watt bulbs, and 100-watt bulbs. That means that in operation, under the standard household voltage, that's how much electricity that they will consume in order to make light. Now, it doesn't stop at 100 watts. I told you that incandescent lights could come in teeny tiny low wattage 15-watt packages like this, up to 100-watt packages like this. But it goes way beyond that. For common household lighting, you're probably never going to see an incandescent light bulb that uses more than about 100 watts to create light. But in the movie industry, where incandescent light has been a staple forever, There are bulbs that those guys use that are up to 25,000 watt bulbs. 25,000 watts. That is a tremendous amount of power. And these things put off a tremendous amount of wonderful light, very good color rendition. Unfortunately, they're rather expensive. A typical 25,000 watt studio light for the movie industry costs about $5,000. I looked up the prices this morning. 1,000 watt incandescent light bulb will set you back about $71 in today's pricing. So think long and hard before you go buy them. They don't last very long. That 24,000 watt bulb I was talking about has a life expectancy of about 20 hours. And they suggest that you change them out when they're about halfway through their life. So 10 hours, another $5,000 for another bulb. The reason the movie industry likes this kind of light is it has a very significant throw. The light travels a long way. It's very bright. And like I've mentioned before, it very accurately renders colors. So it has been perfect for use in the movie industry. So let's get to the reason we're here, lighting for photography. What about incandescent light for photography? Well, the way I think about incandescent light is in one of two ways. Incandescent light can either be a problem that needs to be fixed, or it can be a standalone creative tool for you to use to express your art. So let's look first at incandescent light as a problem in photography. It's mostly going to be encountered indoors, seldom in very large public spaces these days, but certainly in homes where it makes up about 80% of the lighting in the home. And the main issue with incandescent light, especially when it's mixed with other light sources, as it almost always is, it gives off a yellow-orange cast that can really affect the entire photograph. Depending on what you're trying to do creatively, that can be a very negative thing, but not necessarily. So if we approach incandescent light as a contaminant or as a problem in our photograph because of the yellow-orange casts that it throws, we need to understand a couple of important concepts. The first is white balance, and the second is color constancy. White balance is a way that we can correct the color of light so that the colors look natural and expected. So when we set our camera to incandescent white balance, what we're doing is we are trying to change those yellow-orange hues so that they go away, and it will make the colors in the image look like they're being viewed under daylight. Where this becomes problematic is if there is also daylight in the photograph, and then that white balance setting may make the outdoors look far too blue. It will cool off the natural light that's coming in, and vice versa. So we need to be very careful about how we use our white balance, how we select white balance. My rule of thumb is when I assess a scene, especially an indoor scene, I try to figure out what the dominant light source is. What am I going to be keying off to take this photograph? And then I will use a white balance setting that is appropriate for that main light. So if there's plenty of light coming from outdoors and I'm planning on using a flash, I will set my white balance to daylight. Because that will correct the majority of the colors to the way we would expect to see them in daylight. Then there are a couple of things I would have to do to get rid of the yellow casts, but that's easier to take care of once my white balance is set. But let's talk for just a second about color constancy. I think we touched on this last time, but color constancy is something that happens in our brains when we view a scene. We view scenes very differently than a camera does. The camera is simply going to record the intensity and the color of the light as it appears on the sensor. But our brains fix problems that it's not expecting. It will take a scene where the lighting is mixed and it will adjust the colors that we experience in order to make the scene less jarring. It's almost as if we remember how a given object is supposed to look, and our brains correct any lighting discrepancies so that it does. Let's take, for example, an interior room in a house that has a few incandescent tungsten light fixtures. We can shoot a long exposure to gather enough light. A second option, instead of a long exposure, would be a very short exposure, but using flash to fill the rest of the room, the parts not illuminated by the incandescent light. Probably the most obvious option would be to simply add an orange gel to your speedlights, to your flash. That would correct the daylight color of the flash to the incandescent color of the room. And then if you set your camera's white balance to incandescent, everything would come out balanced daylight. I hope that makes sense, because that's a very important principle. Another option would be to set your white balance for daylight and shoot with the flashes with no gels, but add a blue filter to your lens so that the yellow-orange is cut down in the photograph so that you get a more uniform, balanced daylight appearance. So there are several different ways you can get to the same place, and it really depends on your assessment of the scene and how you want to portray it and what color you want to emphasize and what you want to de-emphasize. Another option, which I use occasionally, it often is impractical as I'm usually shooting by myself, but if you're taking, for example, a long exposure of an indoors, take this room without the studio lights. There's a little bit of light coming in from the late afternoon sun, indirect, but most of the light would be incandescent. One of the things that I could do would be to shoot a long exposure and about a third of the way into the exposure, turn off all the incandescent lights. That would be actually a very effective way to tone down the yellow-orange cast that you'd normally see. It would also prevent any actual visible light sources from burning out during a long exposure. So that's another thing to consider. It's oftentimes not practical because it's often hard to turn out incandescent light sources without being in the picture. So it would typically lend itself to a situation where you have remote access to the lighting, but it's definitely a good one to think about. Let me harp on something I said in one of the previous episodes about natural light. One huge advantage that you can get when using mixed light sources, especially if one of them is incandescent, is to shoot in RAW. Shooting in RAW will capture all of the data, and you can do pretty much everything that I'm describing here in post if you need to. I still like to get it as right as I possibly can in the shot, but sometimes that's really difficult to do. And of course, if you shoot in RAW, you can change your mind about the overall look of the scene. You may use an orange gel on your flash and leave the incandescent lights on and shoot the shot as if it is under incandescent light entirely. But when you get that raw image into your processor, if you decide you don't like the look of it, you can cool it off. You can literally shift the white balance so that all of the orange hues are cooled off. So what about incandescent light as a creative tool? There are many ways that incandescent light can be used for creative effect. One example is portraits. I really like portraits shot with that warmer incandescent light, especially if I'm looking to capture gravity and maybe an element of intrigue to the photograph. I think that warmer incandescent light can do all of that. It tends to make the image look a little bit more monochromatic. It tends to reduce the contrast a little bit, but it makes, I think, the shadows look very rich and very interesting. By the way, I know this goes without saying, but you don't have to use incandescent light to get an incandescent look. In a portrait, that would be a good example. Unless I had a table lamp sitting next to my subject, you could simply use continuous LED or even fluorescent light with the appropriate orange warming gel. You could use flash and give the look of incandescent light, or you could use incandescent light. Either ways, there's all different ways that you can get to that. Other places that I think creatively incandescent light is so powerful is with certain product photography. I love it for shooting gold. I think it works really well with some kind of products. Cigars and liquor are two that I think look fantastic. I love lingerie shots shot with incandescent light. Strangely, I get asked to shoot a lot more liquor bottles than I do lingerie pictures. I don't know why. Don't leave any comments below if you know why. I don't want to know. Another place that I love to use incandescent light is shooting certain foods. In this example, I think it was the perfect foil for the darkness of the coffee, the darkness of the pastries, biscuits, whatever they are. And I used this blue tray as a counterfoil to all of that orangish brown that pervades the photograph. This image here is actually a dummy run from a job I was going to do for eyeglasses. The job never transpired, but I did set up the lighting, and this was the way I wanted to shoot it. I like the feel of a fireplace or of candlelight that this color can give. Another use case for incandescent light that I love creatively is warmer incandescent light at night on outdoor scenes, especially when I'm trying to convey warmth and conviviality inside. Take this example. This is a small Italian restaurant in the town that I live in, and I wanted to photograph it in such a way that it looked inviting and welcoming and cozy and private. I decided to use a couple of speed lights, actually large studio lights, with an orange warming gel for these images. Even though it significantly changed the color of the brass and the brass highlights, it made them look a little more golden, and it very much appealed to the client, who really liked the look. It made the devices look a lot more expensive than they did in a more daylight balanced light. It's not often that I look at a product shot and reach for an incandescent looking light source, but for this particular watch, I thought it was perfect. I'm not sure if it was because of the color of the opalescent watch dial looked better in the warmer light, or if it just made the gold look a lot richer, but I think it had a good effect, and I like the overall result. I so liked the gold accents from the highlights that I actually used tiny little gold foil reflectors to pick out a couple of the key features of the watch. And that's another way to amplify your incandescent light. One thing that I love to do for creative reasons, it's quite easy to do, is a day to night conversion. In a case like this, I basically raise the temperature of the whole image while lowering its intensity to give an overall blueness to the light. And then what I'll do is I'll add a layer that I fill with a golden hued uniform color. And then I'll use masks to just ever so gently paint back in a little bit of this incandescent appearing light so that it looks like beams of light coming from within the building. Again, it gives a very similar appearance to the actual incandescent light that I used in that shot of the Italian restaurant. So using it creatively, even when there isn't any incandescent light, there is another cool way to do it. This nighttime scene is an actual photograph that hasn't been adjusted or modified in any way. I shot it at night, and the only source of light is the pool of incandescent light falling on the young people clustered on the little wall underneath the light. Now, this isn't the typical incandescent light. This is even warmer. This is about 2400 Kelvin, and this is what you see from low pressure sodium lights that give this very rich color, which on a very blue, cool looking night, I think was the perfect foil to make these young people look like some type of a secret cabal. The problem with an image like this is you do have to shoot with a fairly slow shutter speed, a fairly long exposure. And it took quite a few efforts before they stayed still enough for me to get a minimum of motion blur. There is still motion blur, which is why I'm not going to blow this image up, but from a distance, it gave just the effect I was looking for. Another example of an interior is this house that I was asked to shoot. Now, the lighting was very mixed. There was quite a bit of ambient daylight coming in through the window in the kitchen, as well as the windows in the living area. And it was quite difficult to balance the light. I really wanted to leave on the very warm light over the stove and over the kitchen table. But at the same time, I didn't want to have a marked effect on the light coming in through the window. So what I actually ended up doing was taking multiple exposures so that I could get the outdoor portion of the photograph well exposed, and then shot the indoor parts of the image with a warming gel on my speed lights to try to slightly warm up the daylight lit parts of the interior. And in this image, I've actually superimposed two different shots, one with the warming gels on the flash and the other to show you what the daylight looked like without the gels. In some cases, I won't try to remove a color cast. I will leave the color cast on purpose. Like in this case, the majority of the living space here in the living room is left alone using the daylight and the flash that I had. But I didn't do anything to try to correct the light coming from the back of the image from a separate space, the kitchen space, which I wanted to leave with this warmer, very much incandescent look. So this was really shot as it appeared, without any attempt to correct the discrepancy in the lighting between the two rooms. I think in this case, it works pretty well. This, by the way, is the exterior of that same house, which was shot under a very bright, very flat sky that the homeowner wanted to be more of an evening time shot, but I couldn't get back in the evening. So I just changed out the sky and then added a bunch of lights that actually weren't there. But that's another way that I can use fake incandescent light to give that same warm and welcoming feel to the image. I like the way that this turned out. Let's talk for just a minute about modifying incandescent light. Now, I'm talking specifically now about the kind of lights we use in the house, the regular tungsten filamented bulbs, all the way up to the lights that are used in the studio, the super high power, high wattage lamps. These need to be modified with extreme care. I don't know if you've ever accidentally touched a light bulb while it was on, but even the relatively low wattage household lights get hot. And I strongly caution you against using any kind of diffusion material that could be flammable around these lights. The higher intensity lights that make up the modeling light on studio lights, they are also incandescent, at least the older ones. The ones I use are. These are actually standard tungsten modeling lights that I use on my Einstein, and my other Paul C. Buff lights use a regular incandescent light bulb. But it's a high power light bulb and it gets scorching hot. Now, I will use these in specially designed modifiers like soft boxes that are made to handle the heat from the modeling light. You have to be very certain that you're using the right kind of modifiers so you don't set fire to something. Because the kind of modifiers you can buy these days that are rated for use with the compact fluorescent lights or with LED lights, they don't get nearly as hot, and they're perfectly safe with those other light sources. But you are putting yourself and your house at great risk if you slap one of those cheap soft boxes on an incandescent light, especially at higher wattages. I think these days most people will either fake incandescent light, like I do a lot, use naturally occurring incandescent light from street lights or whatever, or use it as a low intensity accent light in the photograph. The last thing that I wanted to talk about for each of these light sources is macro photography. And this is going to be a short section because incandescent light just doesn't play very well with macro, whether the macro is outdoors or indoors in your studio. There are much better alternatives to incandescent light. When it comes to macro photography, there really aren't very many, if any, situations in which I will use true incandescent light. I may use LED light, for example, that has a kind of warmish tint to it, like the relatively low power LED lights that I get from IKEA. I'll just use a lot of them, but they will give a slightly incandescent look to the image, but that's just because of the way the LED and the lens has been designed. As far as using actual incandescent light bulbs, they are too hot to work at close quarters. I simply wouldn't want to put an insect under that kind of heat. I mean, if it's a living insect, it won't continue to live. And if it's a dead insect, it will dry up and catch fire if you leave it under a high intensity incandescent light. So it's not something that I use hardly ever. If I want to get that incandescent look, I'll use a gel on my flashes or I'll use a filter on my camera, but I won't add that kind of heat. Like I said at the beginning of the video, they're used in easy bake ovens, and that should tell you something about putting an insect close to a hot incandescent bulb. I think the stuff that came out of my kids' easy bake ovens probably tastes a lot like a desiccated insect would. But yeah, it's probably just not worth the risk. So in summary, incandescent light is absolutely beautiful. Most of the time, it's something that we can use creatively to great effect. Well, I hope that was helpful and enjoyable, and I hope you have a renewed interest in shooting under incandescent illumination. Next time, we're going to be talking about the special case of fluorescent light. If you enjoyed what you have just seen and found it useful, please consider subscribing to the channel, ringing the little bell, telling your friends about it. All of those things would be wonderful. Until we meet again, be well, stay safe. Talk to you soon. Goodbye. While tungsten light filaments are probably the first thing I think about when I think about what tungsten is used for, the second most important, or arguably the most important, is tungsten is the metal that is used to make darts. And darts is something everybody should play because it's good for your spirit, and I'll play you for money. But they're made of, the more expensive darts are made of about 95% tungsten. If you get above 95%, they get too brittle and they'll actually break. But the reason they're great for darts is that you can get a lot of weight concentrated into a very small dart. And small darts are better for accuracy. And you don't want to hear any of this, do you? Well, it's important to me. Buy yourself some tungsten darts and I'll give you a game. An interesting thing about the tungsten filament itself, when you see light bulbs that advertise long life, that's usually because the tungsten filament is heavier. By making a thicker filament, it just lasts longer. The anatomy of the filament itself is absolutely fascinating. If you use a tungsten filament that is too fat and too short, the current will pass through with less resistance and it'll put off less light. So the idea behind the ideal tungsten filament is to make it as long as possible, yet have it coil up on itself as much as possible while still maintaining an order where it doesn't short circuit itself. So how do you make a very long, very, very thin piece of tungsten wire take up a small amount of space yet not short circuit itself? Well, this is how. If you look at these close-up pictures, you can see that the tungsten is first of all coiled into a primary coil, and then that coil is again coiled, which means that a 10 millimeter tungsten filament is actually about 4.5 feet of tungsten wire. It's just very, very fine. The reason that the glass bulb is filled with an inert, non-reactive gas like nitrogen or argon is so that when the current passes through and the element heats up, it doesn't catch fire or oxidize because the gas in this bulb doesn't want to react with the tungsten. Now, the more expensive bulbs that last longer and give brighter light often are filled with a more expensive and harder to come by gas like xenon. And in those bulbs, the xenon even further reduces the evaporation of tungsten. It lessens the blackening inside the bulb. But more importantly, it bounces the atoms of tungsten back into the filament as it glows, making it much longer lasting, much more efficient. I just wanted to show you what happens when you remove this bulb and you pass electric current, regular household electric current, through this filament in the presence of oxygen. it's pretty dramatic. Almost instantly, the tungsten begins to oxidize, meaning there's a chemical reaction takes place where the tungsten that is evaporating from the coil reacts with the oxygen in the air to create a whole series of oxides of tungsten. Interestingly, the filament that I showed you earlier, the springy filament, had already been oxidized. It was the filament that I demonstrated the burning with. You'll also notice that that filament is from a three-way light bulb. There are two filaments. Just in case you were confused, the three different settings when you click on the on-off switch of one of these three-way bulbs will light one. Either the big filament will light, the small filament, or both filaments to give you the three different light intensities from a three-way light bulb. If you were wondering why my light bulb had two filaments instead of the usual one, like in this case, that's what it is. That's a three-way light bulb. So do you know who invented the light bulb? Wrong. It wasn't Edison. Edison was the 23rd person to invent the light bulb. 22 people prior to Edison had either patented or documented the invention of one or another type of light bulb. Most of them were absolute rubbish that make the efficiency of today's light bulbs look otherworldly. But there had been a lot of people working on this long before Edison came along. His breakthrough was using a better kind of glass, getting a higher vacuum, using improved filaments and several other things that made it actually a commercially viable concept, whereas prior to that it was largely experimental. But even Edison was using little scraps of cloth, basically, that were impregnated with carbon that formed the filaments in his light bulbs. And they had great resistance to electricity, and they'd stayed lit for minutes at a time before they caught fire. So it was not until a couple of Eastern European guys came up with the idea of using tungsten. If you ever want to see how the process of science works, look at the history of the invention of the light bulb. If you go back to the very beginning, the first time a scientist passed current through a piece of material and it glowed, you see exactly how science works, because every new invention was built directly off the previous inventions. And it's a wonderful testament to the power of the scientific method. And it still proceeds. I mean, there are still improvements and new breakthroughs in incandescent lighting even today. So that was a bit of a digression, but an important one. For those of you who have a periodic table laid out in front of you and you're trying to figure out why the place where I said you'd find tungsten had an element called W in it, that's because tungsten used to be called Wolfram. And how it got that name is really fascinating. Wolfram derives from two Germanic words. The first one, you're never going to guess this, is Wolf, which means wolf. I'm sorry. I cannot take this seriously. The second part of the word comes from Raben, and Raben means raven. So Wolfram means wolf raven. So now you're probably wondering, what is a wolf raven and what does it have to do with tungsten? Well, there's a Nordic god. I don't know if they still think there's a Nordic god, but his name was Odin. And Odin had pets, but he didn't have cats or dogs like all the other Nordic gods. He had wolframs instead. Anyway, these wolf ravens of his would follow him everywhere he went, and he'd pet them and throw sticks for them. And you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with the name of this dense, brittle, hard metal? Nothing. Nothing at all. It's incredibly disappointing. I spent hours trying to find out. Presumably somebody had been reading a book about Odin the night before he discovered this metal and thought, Wolfraven. I would have called it Allan Wallsium. Hardly surprising they changed it to tungsten. So I'm sorry, I know that story was kind of flat and didn't have a good punchline to it. Neither does this next story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. When I was doing my research, I discovered a compound called tungsten carbide. You've probably heard of it. It's used to harden steel, or it's used as a component in steel. The molecular shorthand for tungsten carbide is WC, Wolfram carbide. And I got to thinking, could it be that the first toilets were made of tungsten carbide? It seems like a very reasonable proposition, because when I grew up in England, the toilets were all called WCs. It had it stamped on the door, especially at school. So I remember being taught that WC stood for water closet, because the Queen didn't want to have to say toilet or bog or anything else like that. So she called them WCs. And anyway, my theory is that they were actually made of tungsten carbide. And I did hours and hours of research. And what did I find out? That I was wrong. They had nothing to do with tungsten carbide. They were, in fact, called water closets. But talking about WCs, do you know that the fanciest toilets that you could buy in the UK in the 1880s were made by a London firm that called itself the world's finest purveyor of lavatorial equipment? And do you know who owned it? Thomas Crapper. I promise, that part's real. Oh dear. But the funniest thing is that the term crapper had been used to refer to toilets before Thomas came along. So his mum and dad must have thought, oh, this will be a hysterical joke. To this day, you can still go to London and at some of the big landmarks that have been around for hundreds of years, you'll see manhole covers that have Thomas Crapper stamped on them, because he made the manhole covers as well. People go all the way to England to get themselves photographed on a Crapper manhole cover. And they're not made of Wolfram carbide either.